the Via Stoica podcast with Brendan and Benny. Powered by viastoica.com, your home for coaching, workshops, quotes, and Stoic content that inspires. Welcome to the Via Stoica podcast. My name is Benny, and today we have a wonderful guest here with us, Jason Nelson. And I'm going to introduce him first for you, and then we're going to have a great conversation about his new book. I want to mention it right at the beginning: A Balm for Your Soul, 6 Seeds for Happiness. Jason he spent 20 years in corporate, helping retail brands scale their online businesses in London before realizing that he wanted more. Not more success or more things, but more happiness. This took him on a journey from big city burnout to finding freedom as happiness cultivator, an accidental Stoic, and the author of the book, Balm for Your Soul, the 6 Seeds of Happiness. And I was fortunate enough to meet up with Jason last summer in the wonderful island of Gran Canaria. And Jason, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Benny. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, it's great. And thank you for writing the book. And I think we have a lot more in common of like a lifestyle, because we met in Gran Canaria, but you are not there at the moment, right?
Yes, so right now I'm in Bangkok. I was recently in Gran Canaria. I'm lucky enough to have some very special friends there. So with connection being a very important seed of happiness, it's very important that I spend time with them and fill my happiness cup there.
Yeah, no, and it was wonderful to meet you. We had some wonderful conversations in the Canary Islands. That was my first visit, but you kind of go between places, right? You go like, and you're in Bangkok
Yes,
right now, and
I discovered Gran Canaria about 4 years ago, and I just so happened to meet the most interesting people there, which keeps on bringing me back, including you, Benny. So I really enjoyed our coffee on the beach, talking all things happiness and beyond.
yeah, no, I really enjoy that too. And as we get started, and I wanted to show the kind of the book here for people looking at watching this the video. I'll definitely recommend getting it. It felt, and we'll get into it later. It felt very personal, right? But also for me as well as a reader, it felt personal because you touch on a lot of things, as we discussed back in the day as well. Like it touched on a lot of things that I am going through in life and working on. So it's very interesting, but as you know, this is a Stoic centered podcast, but I'm not here to turn people into Stoics, but more kind of to inspire people to find their philosophy of life. And I wanted to start there. Is like, well, how would you describe your philosophy of life?
My philosophy of life, that's an interesting one. Certainly caught up with happiness, but happiness is such a broad topic, and we'll get into the detail, but I think it's a practice that delivers happiness. But in its purest sense, my philosophy in life is just be kind to ourselves, kind to others. The world would be a very different place if we all practice kindness.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that's something that is so undervalued, kindness. And especially if you look at the news, if you look at social media, just how people are interacting and how people are reacting to each other and to themselves. I think it's just some more kindness would definitely benefit us all in that sense. And if we then
Definitely.
move to the happiness, right? What and I really like how you describe it in your book, and that journey you really take us through, and it felt like a very vulnerable journey to do as well. But what made you go on this happiness journey? What was the moment that said like, okay, I need a change, and I need to, and happiness is the goal.
It was a process, really. It didn't happen all at once. I feel like there are so many instances throughout my life where happiness was showing up, but I didn't necessarily have the words or the experience to understand the opportunity. So that when unhappiness was showing up, I probably spent too much time in a dance with unhappiness because I didn't have the tools and the awareness and the practice to be able to get myself out of that state. And in modern life, it's so easy to get caught up on the hamster wheel of life, just getting through each day. And the process of stopping. And for me, the really big pause in my life came, as with so many, during COVID, where we were forced to pause. And that pause for me created a real opportunity to think about what I wanted my life to look like. So I then went through a process of just thinking about the steps I had taken to achieve my goals. So, for so long, it was the dream of moving to London, creating a career, creating a life there, coming from a small town in Bedfordshire. That was the dream. But when I achieved that, I didn't know what was next. And around COVID, that pause created the opportunity for me to really reflect and think, what do I want? What's needed for me to really achieve happiness? For a moment, I thought it was a new job, a promotion, it was more money, it was more things, it was a bigger apartment. But actually, when I stripped back all of that, it wasn't more things or more success. It was more happiness. And that's when I really started to map the steps or create a roadmap to achieve happiness.
Nice. And I like how you said, that you dance too much with unhappiness. I think that that's something that I think a lot of people do intentionally. We kind of embrace it, right? It feels maybe comfortable, or we don't know any better. And especially when you talk about, coming from, Bedfordshire, and I come from a very teeny tiny village in the Netherlands, 1,500 people. And then you kind of start to think about like, oh, if I go to the big city, life will be better. I can do all these things, exciting, right? And then when you get there again, then the music starts of a dance you might not want to be caught in. And so I really liked how you got that. And that pause, having that moment to reflect is a really good kind of moment to take stock and maybe make some changes as you did. And so I think that that's we can say like, yeah, COVID was a really bad thing, but if you use it the right way, then it can also be the, to reference your book, the seed to new beginnings and happiness. And I
Yeah.
think that that's a really good step.
And I talk about this in the book, and that is a big part of my happiness was focusing on the things that I can control. And there are events happening in the world like COVID, or, there might be a financial crash or something happening on the other side of the world that I experience on the news. And the previous version of me that struggled with happiness would get caught up in all of those events. And an important step on my happiness journey is just focusing on the things that I can control and looking for the upside. So there's a process of training your brain, and your nervous system, actually, almost like you're going to the gym regularly and you're putting in the work to build your resilience. So actually, when things are happening that are out of your control, your mind starts to switch to the upside the more you practice it. And that was an incredibly important part of my journey up until COVID, but also a significant chapter within the book. So I talk in the book about my formula for happiness, and that formula for happiness. And there are many definitions out there of happiness, and formulas depending on who you're speaking to. But I really like the simple approach to everything in life. So I'd like to keep happiness as simple as possible as we spread the word and we create more happiness. But my formula is positivity plus intention times practice equals happiness. So the positive element of that is really important. It's like, let's think about whatever is happening. Let's think about how I can create an opportunity for this. Let's think about how I can create a moment of reflection for this, or something that is going to benefit me, rather than getting pulled into the negative narrative and then contributing to the global panic and hysteria, which I would suggest doesn't help any of us. And actually, the happier we are, the happier we can make other people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I understand why, people might call you an accidental stoic, because obviously from my stoic mind of view, this rings so true. And that's kind of how I read the book as well. And it's interesting because I mentioned it a few times on the podcast, but one of my sisters, she's very into Taoism and Buddhism, and all of it kind of aligns and goes on the same path, but using different kind of language, right? But what I felt from your book is that it's very much aligned to what I read in the Stoics, but it has this more of a Buddhist Zen kind of feel to it as well, right? I think it is walking right into that middle ground there, and maybe kind of before I wanted to kind of dive into the definition of happiness a little bit more. How do you feel that kind of when people say, oh, like you said that they called you an accidental Stoic, right? As we mentioned as well in the biography, but it does feel a little bit also more to the Eastern, and obviously you spend a lot of time there. How do they influence you in writing this book, but also in writing your, thinking about your philosophy and your formula for happiness?
It's an interesting one because I didn't know too much about Stoicism until I met you and then started following your podcast. So I've learned lots by following your podcast. And it's one of those interesting experiences where you're mentioning the classics, and there are so many elements of it that resonate with me. Although I'd never studied this traditionally, it's just something that feels right within my soul. So when I think about the way that I frame the book and the way that I frame happiness and the very practical steps I outline in the book to achieve happiness, that comes from my experiences growing up. That comes from, me testing and learning and trying different things and really just discovering these things through a practice, really, but not a Stoic or a Buddhist practice, but really just testing and learning what is going to add to my happiness. And this is the collection of things that I've perhaps pulled from different disciplines, sometimes unknowingly, that I feel create a very solid foundation to create happiness.
Yeah, nice. That's and it's good to kind of do things. At least for me, it was a sense of recognition when I came across the Stoics, and also with the Buddhist, lifestyle, the Buddhist philosophy, that you feel like, okay, maybe I am, onto something here, and maybe this is good, and you get kind of I saw myself on the pages when I read the Stoics, and also on, in your book, especially when you talk about, your childhood and your family situation back home, that resonated a lot with me as well, and kind of building your own way, but seeing that. And this is something that I find interesting what the Stoics said. They said, like, if this is the right way to live, then we are not going to be the only ones to figure this out, right? And other people will figure it out. And I think it is important that people do it on their own, right? Because then it makes it more authentic. And then but having guides like your book and like the ancient philosophies will help you kind of um reassure you that, hey, what you're doing is probably good. So I think that that's a key as well there. And if we go into the happiness, how would you define, like you've mentioned your formula for happiness, but how would you define happiness?
Again, there are many different definitions out there. And just to sidetrack a little bit, um, with my book, I really wanted to create something that I felt was missing in the market. And it was a book that I would have loved to have read at 20 or at 30 that would have provided me with some guidance, because we go through life and we are not taught about happiness or regulating our emotions from our parents. My parents struggle with that themselves. And we certainly don't learn about it at school. So we've really got to figure out those principles for ourselves. So it was super important for me to create something that I felt would be a happy, not a happy, but a useful guide for people who were trying to discover and create more happiness in their life. I talk in the book about everybody working out what happiness means to them, because the more I travel and the more people I meet, the more I realize that we are all so connected and we all really want the same things, and the stories that I've shared in the book, they're my stories, but I think they're universal stories. So when people are thinking about challenges with boundaries with friends or boundaries with family members, or the depth of their connection with their friendships, or the fact that their partner may want different things from them and how to navigate that. And self-care, I feel like self-care gets a bad rap because somehow it's considered as selfish to take care of yourself. But I really believe that we're in no position to take care of anybody until we take care of ourselves. So I feel like all of those components are super important parts of happiness, including relationships and connection. But in terms of a definition, I like to keep things simple. So, my simple definition of happiness is an increase of positive emotions and a decrease in negative emotions. And that's how I manage my happiness on a day to day basis. I try and do more of the things that increase my positive emotions, and I avoid the people and the situations which create negative emotions.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I was like, as I was reading your book here in in Granada, going to different places, and then one of the things that I really started thinking about after reading your book was to take stock of like what connections, what people, but what situations drain my energy or feed the more the negative emotions or the negative feelings, and what really helps me to create those positive ones. So that was something that I really enjoyed, right? Those pause moments that you have in the book to kind of reflect and think about the things that you share, but then really bring it to your own life. I think that that's really helpful, and it made me think about, okay, what am I actually practically doing about this, right? Because obviously the Stoics, they talk about, the negative emotions and then focusing more on the positive emotions, doing that out of virtue and all of that stuff. But really to put it into a practical sense and connecting it to life was really useful from, what I got from your book in those kind of moments, the practices I liked as well. And one example that I think, you talked about, your family not being good at emotional regulation, which I resonate with very much. But also, and maybe this is, I don't know how you see that, but it felt for me like an inspiration because I've done the same, right? I left my job in Dubai, a nice paying job, and everything you kind of wanted, that dream life that you had pictured yourself when you were little. But then you've reached all of that, right? You set some really good goals for yourself. You reached it, and then at one point you went into the office with the manager or your boss, right? And being nervous, and that became your first client, if I remember correctly. Like, how how when writing that, like, would that is that kind of you sharing your stories, but it also inspires a lot of people outside. Is that kind of also your goal? And how did that moment? I like how did that moment feel for you? And maybe that will inspire other people to take that step as well.
Ah, thank you for bringing that up. But yes, that was a really important step in my happiness because I had a job that actually I really enjoyed at that point. So I've had jobs in the past I haven't enjoyed, and I talk about that in the book. But this particular job, really enjoyed, loved the team there, really enjoyed working with the CEO. But I had the realization, and this was during COVID, that the irony of the perfect job, working with great people, but still feeling like I needed something else. And all I really knew at that time was that my instinct was to create my own path and to take action to move towards this vision of my future. Now, I didn't have a super clear vision of exactly what that future was going to look like, but I knew I wasn't going to find it by standing still. And I had become quite complacent in the job and my life at that time. And, for so long, being in London was the goal. And then when you take that moment to think about, well, I've got what I thought I wanted to achieve, but this still isn't delivering on my happiness, you then have to dig deep and figure out what your happiness looks like. And in that particular situation, it was a tough decision because, the irony of leaving a job I love to chase my dream, the irony of that isn't lost on me. But it was the universe, if you like, gave me a really positive signal that that was the correct first step. Because at the end of that very emotional conversation with my CEO, when I'm thinking, right, I'm handing in my notice, how am I going to pay my rent? She then says at the end of the conversation, and I'd love to be your first client, which was a massive relief because that took the stress off me getting a client and also meant I could at least pay the bills whilst I started that new journey. So it was, to answer your question, it was very nerve wracking. I feel like whenever we're being brave and we're making big changes in our life, our comfort zone can be so tightly wrapped, it makes it difficult to breathe. But when we give ourselves that opportunity to breathe and reflect and think about what we think is best for ourselves and our happiness, it then gives us the confidence to take that first step. And I think my comfort zone, which I talk about in various elements throughout the book, from, being trapped in a small town, working in a call center, feeling like this isn't really my life, surrounding by people who, were great friends at times, but just didn't necessarily support the vision of myself and where I wanted to go. Their lives were very much focused around the weekend and partying at the weekend, although they didn't particularly have jobs that they really enjoyed. And again, that was okay for me for a while until I had the opportunity to think about, well, do I want to be here in 10 years with these same people having the same conversation outside the same pub every Saturday? And I think there was a moment in the book that I write about where, that moment for me really symbolized the shift that I had to take in my life to be able to walk the path that I hadn't yet laid, but I knew it wasn't going to be found staying still also in that.
Yeah, I love that, and that reminds me of what you said. Like, I think you moved to a different town, and you said like I can be whoever I want to be, right? That kind of liberating feeling, and for me, it's been parts of, like, and as I hear you kind of describing with your friends and going to bars, it feels quite autobiography. Well, I don't know if but it feels fun, very related to my story. So I think maybe that's why it related so much with me, the book, because it felt so similar to a lot of the things that I've been through, and I think that was great to read. And maybe real quick, like if people are in that moment where they are feeling like they see this vision in front of them, maybe not in details as you said, and they are thinking about stepping into that office of the CEO, and needing that little bit of extra bravery to go do it and take that step. What would be a message that you would share to them, and to kind of not push them, but to help them over that threshold of taking that step, to open their lives?
I would simply say trust yourself. No one ever looks back in their final breaths and thinks, I'm so glad I followed the path that my parents wanted for me. I'm so glad I stayed still, although every part of my being was saying move. No one ever has those moments in their final breaths. They say, I wish I loved more. I wish I lived more. I wish I trusted myself more. I wish I showed up as authentically me more. I wish I realized earlier that I've got nobody to impress. And a big part of my journey, which I talk about in the book and I encourage other people to do, is to choose and trust yourself. We're so focused in 2026 on looking for external validation. So, what's happening on social media? Let's go to the doctor. Let's speak to my friends. I really encourage people to spend time with and listen to themselves, because I think that quality, that art of really tuning in to how we're feeling, is being lost as our attention is being taken out there rather than us taking the time to reflect inwards. And we were talking earlier about increasing positive emotions and decreasing negative emotions. Now, that doesn't mean just ignoring the negative emotions. It means sitting with them. Let's understand why I might be feeling this way. Let's try and understand why I'm reaching for another bar of chocolate, as is the case for me. It's like, if I've got into a routine of having brownies every day and I'm feeling like I have this sugar and sweet craving, it's usually because I'm avoiding something, or there's an unhappiness there that I'm trying to patch over with a plaster of chocolate goodiness. But that also in itself isn't the problem, but it creates an opportunity, right? It's like, what's really going on here for me? So it's important for me as part of my story to put down the brownie and just go inwards and think about what's really going on here. And usually what's going on is I'm unhappy at work, or there's a friendship where a boundary is being overstepped, and I've not let I've not let that person know what my boundary is. So they've continued to overstep it. And actually what that's creating in me is a frustration through words unspoken. And I think these are just two fairly easy to relate to examples. I think most of us have experienced elements of that in our life. But when you start listening to yourself, it's a beautiful process because then it's impossible to stop listening. And the more we listen, the more in tune we're going to be with ourselves and our needs, and perhaps most importantly, our happiness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, the cookies, chocolate, that's again, it's also a pitfall for me. But I like how you reframed it. And also about, the imposter syndrome. At one point you mentioned that, and that's where things kind of click for me in certain parts related to picking up signs, right? I think that that's also when we want to be more in tune of who we are, and really able to listen to ourselves. We also have to be able to pick up on the signs. But a lot of the times when we want to go for that cookie or piece of chocolate, our awareness of like, hey, maybe this is a sign, is already kind of ebbed away because of all the endorphins or dopamines that we're getting from that little, sweet thingy. But also the imposter syndrome is, for me, that's something that I've struggled with a lot. And it feels like, when you mentioned like that's also a sign when you're not feeling good about yourself, when your confidence is low, and you start to think like, why am I the one? You mentioned it about, with happiness, like, why am I the one who can write a book like this? And I have the same thing, with Stoic coaching and with Stoic philosophies. Like, am I good enough to talk about this stuff? Look at me, my life isn't perfect, right? But that's a sign of like, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe I need to kind of investigate, why might I not be sleeping well? What is on my mind, right? And not sleeping well leads to bad eating habits, bad other habits. So kind of taking that back, and as you said, we shouldn't ignore those bad emotions. We really should investigate where they're coming from, otherwise they'll just repeat. So I really liked how you kind of clicked and made me aware, at least, of these are also signs of there's something going on, instead of like, oh, I just don't feel good about myself. No, there's something more going on. And I really liked how you made that aware. And kind of, maybe you can talk us through like the six seeds of happiness, because I wanted to kind of dive into them as well and see where they're coming from, because I liked, the formula, but also how you break it down. And you've mentioned like, self-care is the first, but if you can name them, and maybe why you came up with these six seeds of happiness, and how you kind of um, designed this formula.
So the six seeds really was my friend of mine recently asked, was it the chicken or the egg that came first? In terms of, did I come up with these six seeds and then write around them, or did I write around them and then name them the six seeds? So it was the latter. So the way that I created the six seeds was really throughout great conversations I had with people like you, where we would be talking about elements of happiness, and people would share experiences of where their happiness has been interrupted and why. And what I would usually find myself doing is offering advice based on, my take and my experience. And I would usually do that through the form of storytelling, because I think storytelling is an ancient art of communication that is still so woven through important messages in life, in modern life, I should say. So I feel like storytelling is a really important craft to get messages across, and help people understand and find their own answers, because I don't also believe in giving people answers. What I'm happy to do is share my experience and how I overcame obstacles. But then it's really up to everybody to make up their own mind. So, what I've done probably over 2 years was every time I was having these interesting conversations, or I'd be having thoughts about things I might have read about, I would make notes on my mobile notes app. And after about 18 months to 2 years, I looked at all of the notes I'd made and I thought, wow, I think I've got something here. So let's start plotting this out. And I had always thought I wanted to write a book, but I'd never been clear on the subject. And actually, I tried to write fiction in the past, but just the words didn't come. I struggled. But then, as in, almost as if my purpose was so perfectly aligned, when I put my fingers to the keyboard and started tapping, the words just flowed. And very quickly, I created these 6 elements, which I've called the 6 seeds. There's a total of 8 chapters in the book, but these 6 seeds were very organically grown, if you like. And they were identified by me through all of the wonderful conversations I've been having, where I was really identifying for myself and others the key foundation of happiness. And that's where I developed the 6 seeds. So the 6 seeds are self care, which is really all about taking care of ourselves, not just taking care of ourselves from our diets, but from our emotional diets and from the diets of energy and communication that we're receptors of. Um, Second is self mastery, and that's really focused around understanding that we are not our thoughts, we are not our feelings, we are not our ego. All of these things are part of us, but they're not the master of us. In fact, we're the master of them if we want to take the time to really understand how thoughts, feelings, emotions, our ego is showing up in our life, and also to be compassionate with ourselves. So, I really don't think, for example, there is such a thing as an angry person. I think there's a person who feels angry. We all do. But that anger is usually a sign to something that needs to be addressed, something that needs to be changed. And perhaps if somebody hasn't gone through the process of reflection, they feel it and then they have an outburst, and perhaps they might feel regretful later. But what I talk about in the book is, with there being no negative emotions, but perhaps what there are negative responses or negative reactions. And I really want to help the reader understand how their actions might not be serving them and their happiness. C3 is boundaries, which I think is something that I myself have to keep on referring back to and reminding myself of, because I think throughout life, we're constantly having to gently, but with confidence, lay down what our boundaries are. And I often think those boundaries are most difficult to lay with the people we've known the longest. So that's why I think in the relationship section, which I'll come on to, I think, boundaries there are probably most meaningful to us as we're really stepping into ourselves and really embracing our whole selves and not hiding ourselves from people who might have expectations of us from the past. So it's much easier for them to remember the version of us that we were and not necessarily the person that we've blossomed into.
Oh no, that's great. And I just maybe to kind of look at the boundaries part, because I really
Yes.
liked what you said about people we know the longest. That's most difficult with, and I think a lot of people struggle with boundaries, myself as well. I think that that's something that I've got to learn more to do, and as you mentioned, with connecting that with self care and self mastery. I like the build up. We'll go to the last three of the seeds in a bit, but I like that build up. This is really kind of like focusing, building your own part, right, where you make sure that you take care of yourself, make sure that you understand yourself, right, the self mastery, and then the boundaries. And I also feel that when you start to make changes, they're mostly internal, and the people around you, especially like again how you said that, the ones that you know longest, because they have a certain image of you, they can get then suddenly a shock when you make certain decisions outwardly, right, because you've been doing this internally for a while, but they are not used to it yet. And That's something that I struggle with as well, with setting the boundaries. I'm often too nice but not kind, right? And I think you mentioned that as well at one point in the book, if I'm correct. But it's nice how you, is that also kind of how you set them up, the first three to be more internally, and then more the next one's a bit more externally?
I would like to say that I had that forethought, but no, that's a complete chance that it's worked out that way. And I think for all of the six seeds, these are the tenants, these are the components that if we have got ourselves to a good place in each of those elements, then we can confidently create, manage, and continue lasting happiness. And that really is the objective of the book. I think, as a framework, if people are feeling less happy than they would like to be, I'm very confident that it's going to be because they haven't been cultivating at least one of these seeds. So, what the book perhaps could be useful for in somebody on a journey of happiness is for them to have a gentle guide that I hope the book is to help them really discover what within that seed has been overlooked, hasn't been fed, and what steps, what practical steps can they take to get that seed flourishing. And I'm a very practical person, and perhaps this lends itself well to Stoicism as well. So, what I really wanted to create was a book that wasn't just about identifying the issue, but also helping you come up with a solution that you can easily implement in your own life.
Nice, I like that. And happy coincidences are always welcome, right? If it kind of, but that's kind of how I read it. And then as we progress to like the last three, because they did feel a little bit more about the connection with all, and I think that again that's where it really aligns with Stoic philosophy, because we can only live better within the world around us if we are better connected with ourselves, right? So can you take us through those next three seeds for
Sure.
happiness?
So, those seeds are kindness, and that starts with a kindness to ourselves. I feel like we are far harsher to ourselves than we would be to anybody else in our lives. And if we spoke to our best friend the way we spoke to ourselves, we'd soon be without one. So, what I really encourage within this chapter is for people to identify how they can be kinder to themselves and the practical steps they can take to be kinder, to celebrate themselves, to catch their patterns, to catch their language that might not be supporting the person that they want to be or the type of happiness they want to create. And you're right, I make a very clear distinction between kind and nice. Whereas nice exists in the social realm of surface politeness. Kindness goes a lot deeper. It takes all of the positive attributes of nice, but it has the additional benefits of compassion and boundaries. So, yes, it's important to be kind, and often that's being nice, but sometimes being kind to ourselves and being others wouldn't necessarily be considered as nice in that moment. And sometimes being kind takes a bit more courage, but the benefits of kindness on you and those around you as it relates to your happiness are massive. I just think it's, for me, again, if I think about my journey, always smiling when I didn't feel like smiling, always feigning happiness in moments when actually I don't want to say I'm fine in response to how are you, which is the nice thing to do. I want to say, hey, I'm not having a great day. This has happened and I could really do with some support. That might not be considered a nice response, but certainly has the ingredients to create a very kind interaction with the right people around you to support you. And I have a real people pleasing tendency. And I think the people pleasers amongst us will identify many moments in their lives where they've been nice but they haven't been kind to themselves, or they've said yes whilst every fiber in their body screaming no. And that I don't think is helpful to, the person that you're feigning niceness for, or for yourselves, because our body, somebody wrote a book recently called Our Body Keeps the Score. And I really believe that it does. So I think all of those words unspoken, all of those feelings unexpressed will fester away, will um, cause us to be unwell, create discomfort. And actually, why not take more steps to create comfort and create ease and create flow? And that's really what I wanted to focus on with the chapter around kindness.
Yeah, and real quick because I again, as a people pleaser myself, and I also read this book, No More Mr. Nice Guy, which sounds like you have to be a strong, tough person, or whatever. But it's really about like being kind and yeah, kind, sincere, and it kind of makes me think about when you had a program of like Britain's Got Talent, and you have these people who can't really sing or whatever. I think friends would have been probably a bit too nice to them, and maybe like sometimes you got to say, hey, you know what, maybe this isn't your skill, and doing it in a nice way is possible. But I could have used that in maybe in certain moments in your life, and as the Stoics go, and I had a great conversation with Dr. Margaret Graver about emotions and Stoicism, and she said, doing the good thing isn't always comfortable, right? That's why courage is one of the virtues. But sometimes saying being kind means saying the things that people don't necessarily want to hear, right? And then obviously the delivery brings that, but it also goes to yourself. Being kind to yourself also means that you should allow for listening to things that you might not want to hear, the critique, the negative things, and taking out the sting, but looking at the message and looking at the information. And then you can really work on yourself. And it's not comfortable, but sometimes that's the best medicine, right? The doctors, if you go to a doctor's, it's not always going to be comfortable, but they will help you get better in the long run. So
Yeah,
no, appreciate that. That the fourth seed of kindness, that was a big one for me as well.
super important one for most people. And what I include in the book are practical steps when people catch themselves being nice when what they want to do is be kind. So
Mm.
I've included several scenarios with the common conversations that might come up, and how you would approach it with kindness instead of niceness. So the feedback that I've gotten is that's been super useful for people pleasers just like us.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember, and I was reading through those scenarios, and it's like, oh yeah. And that was like, because as I was reading through that part of the book, it's like, okay, but it would be nice. And then I turned the page, my Kindle, and then the examples. I was like, oh wow, that's perfect. That was exactly what I was looking for. So
I'm glad you
that
enjoyed
was
them.
that was good. And then going to the fifth one, it's a natural nurture relationships.
Yeah, so relationships are such an incredibly important part of our happiness. So it's relationships with coworkers, it's relationships with friends, and the different shades of friends, right? So those people that we've been to school with that may or may not still be in our lives, the new friends that we're making, and how we're showing up that might be different with our new friends versus our old friends, which comes back to, the self mastery piece and really understanding ourselves and being authentic in the person that we want to be. And I often think in relationships, it's much easier to show up as your most authentic version with very new people, because they are almost starting from a clean slate. But I think there's lots of learnings that we can take about ourselves when we really consider the dance that we are having with those new people in our lives, particularly if we compare it to family relationships or indeed our long term friends. But the reason why this is such an important seed is because of how we show up in relationships and what we're getting from relationships. So you mentioned the energy earlier, and really reading energy and how we feel when we're around people. So what I talk about in the book is being able to identify your um, energy angels, your energy vampires, and the energy neutrals. So those people that, don't give or take energy, and that hopefully is going to be the majority of people that you interact with. But I think when we are much more cognizant around the people we're around and how we feel when we're with them, and perhaps more importantly, once we've left, I think by really understanding what those people are bringing up for us, how those people are making us feel, it can help us really make decisions about our friendships based on what's most likely to bring ourselves and therefore other people most happiness. But for so many of us, and certainly was my case, I just free fall through life, kind of picking up friends without really thinking about it and thinking about how they are impacting on me. And we have this term today, which is toxic friendships. And I've definitely had friendships in my life that, you know, we've laughed a lot, perhaps, but there wasn't necessarily a kindness there in the friendships or a real support or a real championing. And much earlier in my life, particularly when I moved to London and I was just dazzled by the bright lights and the excitement of the big city, I was just picking up friends like loose pennies as I made my way. And a big part of my happiness was stopping and thinking about, if I'm a reflection of the five people closest to me, what should those five people look like? And then being intentional about the types of friendships that I wanted to create. And also, who did I want to be in those friendships? Because it's so easy in relationships that don't serve us to think it's all about them and they've made me feel this way and it's because of them. And actually, a big change in my life came when I stopped pointing the finger at them and I started pointing the finger at myself and thinking about, what am I getting from this relationship? What am I getting from this participation? And just being really honest with myself about that was a super important part of my journey to happiness. So this doesn't mean every single relationship in your life needs to be reviewed, but hopefully, what it will encourage people to do is think about the relationships that aren't contributing to their happiness and think about how they might want to change those relationships. Because, we talked about boundaries earlier. Most boundaries are undrawn, which is why people overstep them. And actually, when we let the people closest to us know what our boundary is and how we might have felt when they overstepped it, they perhaps would not be the sort of person that you want to cultivate a long lasting friendship with if they said, that's not important to me and I'm going to continue to behave that way. Most reasonable people, most reasonable, loving people would say, my goodness, I didn't realize. Of course, I won't do that again. I'll be much more considerate of that area. But hopefully, the book gives people the language, the tools, and the confidence to draw those boundaries.
Oh, no, I definitely think that they will. And as you talk about, the relationships, and again, these are also signs and cues of, who is giving and who is taking. And, that reminds me of the three different kinds of friendships that Aristotle put out. You have, the friendships of utility, which is, you give and take, friendship of pleasure, which is, common in bars and everything. And then the real friendship is the friendship of virtue, right? Where you just do good because they are good people to you and you don't need anything back. It's just kind of a those friendships that maybe you have the same as you travel and you go back and meet some people you haven't seen for a long time. It just feels as if you never left, right? Just it kind of feels good. And to kind of segue that into the last seed is like I liked how you kind of set your boundaries on when you went back to London with your family, and then you had like a wonderful conversation, right? So you figured out what the good relationships were, or like, well, the relationships, family is something you can't choose. But then, in the last seed, the deepen the connection is where you kind of build on those relationships that you had and that you wanted to cultivate more, right? Is that correct on how seeing it? And can you take us to that last seed
Yeah,
of
sure.
happiness as well.
A beautiful segue into the final seed and perhaps the most important seed, which is about connection. So, you can have a relationship with anybody. Your delivery guy you have a relationship with, but in terms of connection, there's only a small number of people in our lives that we are going to have true connections with. But I feel like it's such a fundamental and important part of happiness, and we can think about that connection, as you've mentioned, as a connection with our family or a connection with our friends. But it's those moments where you come away from those people and your heart feels full. You feel happier, you feel more energized. And I think as this relates to family, in my family, and I think in many families, we have patterns of behavior. So in my family, it's our love language is banter and sarcasm, which, has its place and can be fun and creates lots of laughs around the dinner table. But it can also, when that's the way of showing love, actually what I realized as part of my journey was I was missing the words of love and encouragement. And I couldn't just assume that there was love beneath the laughter. Actually, I needed something more meaningful. So, what that meant for me was we were never a family of I love yous. So, when I went to university, for example, at the end of the call, I said to my mum, love you. And the first time she nearly dropped the phone. But now here we are 25 years later. She's the one that says at the end of a call, oh, love you, miss you. And it's just become part of her behavior. So that for me is a little way of saying, look, if we're not getting what we need from family members, why don't we highlight what they're doing right? So when she started saying, I love you, I then responded with a positive affirmation of, oh, I really love it when we end a call with, I love you. And actually, just doing that as setting up the foundation of our call, it now happens effortlessly. And I think that's just a little example of if we're not entirely happy with the way that we're connecting with our family members, rather than waiting for them to change, perhaps we can start introducing what we would like to see and start modeling that.
I think that that's a good example, right? Of like setting the example of what you kind of, setting boundaries isn't always just setting, hey, I don't like this or I like this, but just showing by your behavior. And sometimes that will shock people, right? Like as you said, your mom nearly
Yeah.
dropped the phone the first time. But then it opens an eye to the other people. It's like, hey, this is an option, right? This is something that this person clearly likes to express, and maybe me too, but I just find it difficult to do so. So then you're helping them over that boundary, over that step, and saying, okay, let's, and then obviously affirming it when they also do that, right? So instead of leading by dragging them along, you just say like, no, this is what I do, and this is, again, it's a different kind of boundary that you're setting. So, and it deepens the connection with those people, right? Because they see you really who you are, your values, your priorities, and what you find important in life.
And I talk in the book about, in terms of changing behavior, let's create a system, let's create a process where we're catching people doing things right and celebrating that. It's so much more effective if you do want to change behavior to celebrate what people are doing right rather than focusing on what they're doing wrong. So, of course, if I took that from a different angle, I might have said, Mum, you never say I love you, rather than actually modeling the behavior I want to see. And I know that she loves me, but she just has a pattern of showing it through, a big hug when I see her, or always making sure she makes the most delightful food when I come. And, this is how she shows love. But if there's something I need from the people I love, this is how I would suggest that we let them know, or certainly has worked well for me. But connection extends beyond the family to the people we love the most in our lives, so creating friendships with people who really understand you, that where you can show up as your most authentic selves. And after a lunchtime of laughter and tears and great food, you leave them, but still feeling their presence, still feeling what their happiness, what their energy has created in terms of its impact on your happiness. It's those types of connections where, it's not just a date in your diary to meet a friend for beers, but it's making space in your heart for people that you really care about. And you come away from those moments feeling like a better, happier version of yourself. So I think in many ways, this is the most complex of seeds because it really relies on your connection to others. But I talk in the book about practical steps that we can take to get out there and connect with people who are like minded, who are on a similar journey, who have similar interests. Because I hope the book will be the friend, the loving, the supportive friend that perhaps people can't have these conversations where they aren't currently having these conversations, but where they are currently having these conversations about happiness, kindness, boundaries, relationships. Hopefully, the book can be an aid, a support to really encourage those conversations and help people achieve lasting happiness.
No, definitely, and I think that that's why the flow of the book also goes quite well, right? Because you can't show people your authentic self if you are not able to realize who your authentic self is, right? So you need to take all those other steps if you want to deepen those connections. And a lot of the things you can kind of do more or less at the same time or practice as you figure out one step of your self-care, your mastery, the boundaries, and then you work through the kindness and the relationships. But then when you get to those deepening, you really kind of you need to have those other steps in place for a certain amount at least to be able to show like, hey, this is my authentic self, right? Because if you don't know, then they're not gonna guess it, right? Or some people might even know a little bit better than you. That's why I think it is important as well to get that support in and to get all the feedback in from the people around you, and sometimes even ask them, it's like, hey, can you give me some of the qualities that you think is good, or maybe some of those qualities that you think I could work on, and then you can get a better view of who you are
Yeah,
as a person.
definitely. I mean, I personally feel that when I'm having very surface conversations, it's like the junk food of my social life. It's like it feels nice in the moment, but then when I step away from it, I feel like I need something more fulfilling. Whereas I feel like a really connecting conversation, like the one that we're having now, and the one that many of us have with the people we care most about, where we can be our authentic self. You walk away from those conversations feeling nourished, and I want to create opportunities for more of that.
I love that, and I think and I love that analogy what you mentioned in the book. The fast food of conversations. That was the first time. It always reminds me of like having a McDonald's hamburger, and it's just like after 5 minutes you're already hungry again. And the same
Yeah.
thing with as an introvert, those kind of chit chat. I don't do them well. People ask me like, how are you doing? Is like, I'm good, but let's go into interesting topics, right? Okay, let's get that out of the way. And it's also a little bit of a Dutch thing. We're quite direct, and it's like, okay, just tell me what you want to talk about, and let's go. Right, all of that stuff. It's good to know, but as an introvert, it feels like those kind of conversations are some of my energy vampires, and it doesn't really matter of who I'm talking to, but then if we get to go deeper, and my brain gets to work, and I get to be inspired by the person I'm talking to, then it becomes something that really gives me energy. So I think that is such a key point to make in those conversations. And I wanted to ask as well, like we've looked it through the 6 seats of happiness, and you've also mentioned that some people they might need a little bit more work on this one, and others on this one. The same thing for example, the four virtues of Stoicism, right? For me, it's temperance for a lot of time. We go back to the cookie example there. But did you have some of the seeds of the 6 seeds that required more work from you than others? Which one came more natural, and which one really kind of needed more of an
Hmm.
effort?
It's an interesting one because I really feel like they are happiness is motion.
Mm.
So all of these seeds need to be practiced daily. And the more we do it, the easier it becomes. And I try and lay it out very simply in the book with very practical examples and steps that people can take. But for myself, the one that I still struggle most with, I would say, is boundaries. So that's something I often need to remind myself of, because there are opportunities every day. And, we also need to be kind to ourselves. So there are days when you know you should go to the gym, but actually you're just feeling really tired. So you are just going to sit down in front of Netflix with your favorite meal and have a chill night. And that's okay. So I think a big part of happiness is also removing the shame and being really compassionate with yourself, knowing that there's always tomorrow. So, yeah, I'm taking a break today. So, actually, somebody's just overstepped my boundaries, but I just haven't got the energy to raise it. And, perhaps I will next time. But what I did, certainly in the earlier days, is I would let those conversations replay in my mind over and over again, like a scratched record. But now I've got so much better at being compassionate with myself. So I'm better at not beating myself up because of what I didn't do. But I also know there are times when, perhaps I could have reinforced a boundary in that moment, but for whatever reason, I just didn't have the energy to. But also, that's okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes from like the kind of practice, right? With setting boundaries, it's not always easy to do it in the moment. Like that's kind of flusters me a lot of the times when in the moment things happen, and then I look back, it's like, oh, I should have done this. And as you mentioned, I used to do the same thing, get angry at myself or say, oh, why did you do this? But now I use it as a practice. It's like, okay, I can go over that conversation maybe once or twice, kind of see how I could have, responded better, maybe ask someone for advice to prepare myself for the next time. And usually that kind of helps me grow. So you can, instead of being frustrated, you can use that as a vehicle to grow in that kind of area where you feel that you're lacking, right? And as we almost start to round up the conversation, I have a few more questions. To be honest, I can speak for longer, but also have to be, considerate of your time. But one of the things that really stood out to me in the book is, and you had a very personal note added to the book on March 18, 2018. And as I read it, and you even described as I remember correctly, that it was kind of like a doubt whether you wanted to incorporate this note in there. But I found it was very inspiring for me. And I'd like you to kind of talk to us about that note a little bit, and also what you would like to have, like, um, what made you decide to put it in there, and what you would like to the reader to get out of that.
So you're right. I did really consider whether I included that journal entry from a time in my life when I needed more happiness, but I didn't have the tools to create it. Um, but it felt like so many things in my life weren't going my way. So I had a job that I really wasn't enjoying. They weren't treating me respectfully. And I felt like I would be treated far better elsewhere. But I felt like, well, it pays well. I've got bonus coming in 6 months. Although it really doesn't bring me happiness, it does pay the bills. And sometimes it's better the devil you know. So that was one element. Of course, better the devil you know is another clear blocker for happiness, keeping us in a comfort zone, often of disquiet. It's like, I'm not happy with this, but actually the alternative could be worse. So why don't I just stay here? So the alternative was far better, and the alternative is far better for anyone in a similar situation. But I also had health issues. So my back was really playing up. I had sciatica at the time, and it kind of still stays with me. But I realized that my sciatica is like my internal alarm system. So when I'm not taking care of myself, when I'm feeling anxious, when I'm feeling unhappy, I noticed that there's a flare up in my lower back. So my back was flaring up at the time. I was trying to manage it with painkillers and ibuprofen unsuccessfully. I also felt like I wanted something else in my life. This was very much the situation of being in London, but feeling really lonely in London, a city of 8 million people, just feeling like I didn't have as many of those connections as I really wanted. And I wasn't living a life that was true to me. I would get on the London Underground in the morning, which, packed in like sardines. They wouldn't treat animals that way. It's against the law. And holding on to the rail for dear life as you're whisked off to a job that you hate. I just thought I have to change something. Something has to give in this moment. But what really struck me as I read back my journal entry is it wasn't just one area of my life that was adding to my unhappiness. It was so many. It was like a patchwork of unhappiness that I had let free fall over the years just because I wasn't observant of the fact that happiness should be my objective. So happiness wasn't my objective then, right? It was about the right job, the right apartment, the right relationship, living in London. But little did I know that's where my happiness journey just began. But for so many, it's where their happiness journey ends, right? That's where the Hollywood movie usually ends. But creating change at that point was almost, I couldn't ignore it because it was so painful. It was painful literally, but it was also painful figuratively, like it was hurting my soul every day to go into that job. I felt like, you know, we talk about Sunday blues. I absolutely had Sunday blues. So I'll be waking up on a Sunday morning, thank God, right, okay, last day of the weekend, now time to go back to work and mentally preparing myself for that. And it becomes exhausting. But I saw so many other people participating in that dance. So somehow it normalized it. But as I read back that journal entry, it almost read like a different person from the life that I've created now. But that life has been created by taking one step, which led to another step, which led to another, and having confidence that wherever I get to, although I don't know what the end goal is, I have confidence that it's got to be better than where I am. And I need to be brave and take the step. And whenever I've done that in my life and it's created a massive shunt, a massive change, beautiful things have always come out of it.
And I think that that's the, and as I listen to you talk, and I really like that entry as well. I also feel that sometimes we need those moments in life, right, where you kind of hit the wall, and then it's up to you, right, to make that decision to see, okay, this is what I need to do. And when you talk about going into the underground and packed in sardines, I had a job in Dubai where the work itself was good. It wasn't that difficult, pay was great, but then as I walked into the office, I saw all these figures the same as me, with the blue shirts and slacks and going and I was like, oh, this is just not me, right? This is just, even though all the other stuff is exactly kind of what I had in mind, right? It's still, when you get there, it isn't what you need in life, and it isn't the most important. And reminds me of this quote by Jim Carrey that I always loved. It's like, he said, more or less like a paraphrase it, but he said, I wish everybody could experience what it's like to be famous and wealthy, then they see that it's not at all what they believe it should be,
Yeah.
right? And if you have that dream life and then suddenly you just get into the same routine and all that stuff, but if your goals are geared towards externals, career, money, all of those things, and really ignore the ones that are important, right? Your happiness, or as the Stoics say, your soul, your character, which really feed up into that happiness as well. It's like all of those combined, that's what we make progress to, right? Instead of saying like, that's where I want to be. It's like, no, I'm trying my best to get there. I'm not going to be perfect. That's where you show kindness and compassion, but I'm just going to try to do my best to get there. And again, just read the signs and try to be happier every day a little bit more than I can, right?
And one of the first reflections in the book are really about defining what happiness means to you,
Mm.
because happiness is different for everybody. And your happiness is not going to be found in an Instagram reel. It's not going to be found in your favorite TV show. You really have to go inwards to figure out what your happiness is. And then once you understand that, and there's quite a detailed practice within the book to help the readers understand that. It's like once you've got that formula, you then just need to rinse and repeat. Try things. Let's see how they impact on your happiness. If it increases your happiness, great. Keep it in your happiness project. If it doesn't, remove it. Let's try something else. And actually, through that trial and error and just being cognizant of how you're feeling energetically as a result of all of these tests is a surefire way to get you to a much happier place.
And I think that that's also the beauty of life, right? The experimenting parts, the figuring things out, the going on that journey of discovery of like, who am I? What works? What doesn't work? And oh, this doesn't work. Great, now I know. I think that makes life interesting. And I had one more question for you before we start to wrap it up. Is obviously you've written this book, and I definitely recommend people to go buy it and read it because it helped me with a lot of new and great insights on who I am and how I can create this journey for myself. But how did the writing of the book and after you finished, how did that impact you? Because it was quite personal, right? You put a lot of yourself out there on the book, and for example, that note that we mentioned before already was very personal, and the relationship with your parents and friends and all of the, at the, from your entire life. But how did that impact you as a person writing the book? And then after you finished, how did you feel about that?
It was very cathartic. It felt like a therapeutic process. So, in one way, it was great to just because I wrote it, as you know, like a conversation between two friends. So, it really just feels like I was having a wonderful conversation with a dear friend, and hopefully, they were adding to their happiness by me sharing my stories and what I've learned on my happiness journey for the last 20 or 30 years. So that part was very therapeutic. I think the other part is I feel very happy that it's now finished. It feels like a little bundle of joy that I've delivered to the world. I got to the point where I was swapping out adjectives and thinking, is this the right noun? And I was just doing so much tweaking around the edges that I had to get to the point and say, okay, this is now ready to share with the world. But hopefully, when people read it, they'll experience it not as a typical book, because I'm not a published author. I've never published anything before this. And actually, I didn't write this by following any strict guidelines on how you write a book. So, I'm sure there are guidelines and there are formulas and there are frameworks, but I didn't follow any of that. And actually, I wanted to write something that I would really enjoy reading. And I feel very confident that this is a book that will resonate with most people and will help them create more happiness in their lives and the lives of others.
Well, I think you did a great job, and writing it the way you can see that it's authentic, right? As mentioned in the book, that it's really important to show, who you are. And I think you did a great job in the book. And for me, it read partly as if I was reading about my own life, not all
Oh,
the
amazing.
details
Thank you.
specifically, but as you said, like a conversation with two friends. That's really what it felt to me. And I liked the pauses in there as well, just to kind of, it's okay, what have I really read? Because sometimes we read through these books and it just goes from one page to the next. But here I was really, okay, take a step back and see how it really applies to you in your life and where do you need to do better. I think that was really good. And where can people find you and where can they buy the book? Because I recommend people go and read A Balm for Your Soul. Where can they find it, and where can they find you as well?
So they can find me on social media at I am Jason Nelson, and the book is available in print, ebook, and audiobook on Amazon. And the audiobook is also on Apple and Spotify.
Nice, great. And we'll put everything, all the information, in the description and all of those great stuff. And if you
Mm.
follow me on the social medias, you can find Jason there as well. So check out his content because it's really nice and it's inspiring as well to see. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Jason, for being on the show. And we'll hope to see you in the next one as well.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.